ingredients you seek will not be easy to come by. They grow in some of the system's most hostile environments. You can see why we turn to you for help.
I give you coordinates. You go... You come back again soon.
welcome back to the Walking Dead retrospective, where today we'll be continuing our look back at the prison arc and starting to talk about the introduction of the first major villain of the series, that being the infamous Governor. But we've got a ton to talk about, so hello and welcome back to the Walking Dead retrospective, where today we will be taking a look back at the absolute doozy that was Season 3 and the respective comic book issues covering the prison arc. First and foremost, the story of the third season, as well as most of the following ones, will be split into parts, as there is simply way too much to talk about in any reasonable amount of time. You see, while reaching a second and third season is a goal for many shows out there, in the case of The Walking Dead, they were merely stepping stones, with Season 3 in particular catapulting the series to over 10 million viewers. And as such, today we'll be covering only the pre-Governor arc. And with that, let us not waste any more time and jump straight into the pre-season events. If you've been following the retrospective series, you'll know that I like to start these with a bit of a meta discussion to paint a scene of the external factors surrounding the franchise. And with the highly anticipated third season, there is a lot of that. The first thing that I want to bring up actually takes us all the way back to the premiere of Season 2, as it was the record-breaking first episode that got the show renewed for a full third season ahead of Season 2 even airing. With the levels of success the show was seeing, a renewal was basically guaranteed, but renewing it a full year in advance still says a lot. And keep in mind, these are not modern times, where 5 seasons of a show are confirmed just because of streaming wars trying to get market share. And while we're back in Season 2, a very important note that we discussed at length before is the replacement of Darabont as the showrunner, with Glenn Mazzara taking over the role. And to illustrate the magnitude of this change, let us look at how much of the source material was adapted throughout the first 3 seasons. The first season, consisting of only 6 episodes, adapted 9 issues, making that roughly 1.5 issues per episode. Season 2, notorious for its slow pace, consisted of 13 episodes but adapted a mere 3-ish. So that's roughly a quarter of an issue per episode. Season 3, on the other hand, has 16 episodes and adapted 26 issues. And, depending on how you look at it, you could say it adapted even more than that. That is even faster than the pace of Season 1, but keep in mind that here, the story is already moving forward. There is no naturally slower build-up as there is with the first season. And this is why I kept calling this one particularly difficult to put into a single video, and that will only become more clear as we get further on. In short, the pacing of Season 3 was the likes of which we have never seen before or after in the series, even to this day. But now, let's start slowly moving toward the actual events of the season, starting with the trailer. Personally, I think this is the Comic-Con where The Walking Dead really became what it is. Sure, the seasons before also had a presence, but none of them really had such a memorable trailer as the one from here or after. You've already heard me go on about the soundtrack of the series, and it's in the trailer where we get the absolute banger that is Black by Carrie Kimmel. And since we're talking about the soundtrack, I might as well bring up Last Man Standing by People in Planes. Both of these are absolutely brilliant songs that to this day are on my playlists. So if you've forgotten about them, I most certainly recommend giving them a listen. Though that is not the only reason why I brought up the trailer, as this is also the big reveal of David Morse as the Governor. For those of you who have not read the book, this picture alone should speak magnitudes as to how different his portrayal was of him, which we will of course talk about much more in depth later. But if you look back at the archives on things like Reddit, you can immediately tell that some comic book readers really weren't too big of a fans of the casting. Mostly because Morse just does not look like the brutal pirate in the book. But for now, just keep in mind that people's expectations going into the TV show were already quite different when compared to the book, since obviously back in the book days we had absolutely no clue about upcoming plots or characters. And lastly, as a part of this mini preseason discussion, this is also where we get one of the most memorable Walking Dead posters of all time in my opinion. Whoever came up with the line of "Fight the Dead, Fear the Living" tagline deserves a lot of praise, as it is seriously one of those phrases that I will never forget. I don't know if this is just nostalgia or what, but whenever I see this poster, I just straight up get chills. But now, we have finally arrived at October of 2012, and Season 3 is just around the corner. Going into the third season, expectations were very high, simply because of the anticipated introduction of the Governor. But, due to the pacing discussion we had before, no one could have imagined how fast the story would be moving, and basically left everyone floored as soon as the first episode. But just before we jump straight in, we have a few comic book events to tie up. In the books, we left off the events of Season 2 with the main group seeing the prison for the first time. But Herschel, his family, and Glenn stayed behind, so they don't play into the immediate events here. Instead, it's just Rick, Tyrese, and Andrea going through and clearing out the prison. Similar to the TV show, it does a very good job of showing how much stronger the group has gotten throughout the winter, with the trio being able to clear the entire yard without too much hassle. Speaking of the adaptation, the initial events play out quite similarly, only here, all of the characters have a larger role in the initial clearing of the prison. Personally, I think despite this being a very minor change in the grand scheme of things, I think it does do a better job of showcasing the development of these characters as well. I'll bring this up again a little later, but some of the comic book characters do in some instances seriously leap forward in their willingness to do certain things in the apocalypse, which can sometimes seem a little bit jarring, but for now, just keep that in mind. Still talking about the TV version, you'll immediately notice just how much faster the overall pacing is. By minute 12 of the premiere, they've already cleared out the first fenced-off section and are talking about pushing further into the prison. And I have to bring up just how masterfully this episode is written in that sense, as it's here where we get the brilliant moment around the campfire. Again, we'll talk about this much more as the story goes on, but the quite extreme juxtaposition of this peaceful and beautifully performed song by Emily Kinney, Beth's actress, and Rick stepping in to tell them that this isn't over just yet and they have to go further into the prison, worked really well to set that almost sorrow tone. Unlike the long, drawn-out periods we had in Season 2, here, it's those slow moments that are merely sprinkled in, and most of the episode is pedal to the metal, serious apocalypse. Though again, I really like the hopeful yet still sorrowful vibe that we get here. The next morning, in both versions, the survivors prepare to go into the prison itself. Though in the TV version, there are quite a few remixes to talk about. First and foremost, it is of course the difference in the characters. In the book, it's Tyrese and Andrea, none of which are present in the adaptation. So instead, we have Glenn, Maggie, Daryl, and T-Dog going in alongside Rick. After the cell block is cleared, the group gets settled in straight away without too much hassle, and in short, they have a new home. It's also in the premiere that we jump over to Michonne, who's been looking after the very sick Andrea throughout the winter. Note that Michonne is not in the books yet, and Andrea is back at the prison. This is just a short teaser though, and not much else happens on their side during the premiere. Back at the prison, and yes, we're still going, I did warn you about the pace, an expanded group is now venturing deeper into the tombs in search of an infirmary and other supplies. This time, and this is very big, Herschel is tagging along as well. Quick note here, as I kind of alluded to in the Season 2 video, you can basically think of this and his comic book counterparts as two different characters, and this will only become more pronounced later on. But during this run, Herschel is bitten on his leg, and we get the infamous scene where Rick has to chop it off in a desperate attempt to save him. Now, there are a lot of things to mention here. Firstly, and this is very important, This single event masterfully sets the tone for the rest of the prison arc. Keep in mind that there was absolutely no precedent in Rick attempting this. It was a split-second decision purely based on his guts, and it establishes the absolutely brutal nature of what would come next. As he himself said, he is no longer the good guy, and so morality of what he is doing never even comes into play here. He will do anything and everything he can do to ensure the group's survival. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, this was a massive shock to everyone, both the comic book readers as well as the TV audience. While this sort of thing happens in the book, it happens 8 chapters from now, and not to Herschel, to Alan. And on top of that, Alan does not survive this. So you can imagine what was going through the heads of comic book readers here. As I said, in universe, there was no precedent that this would work. Well, in the comics, even with Herschel's medical assistance, Alan does not survive. So many were convinced that Herschel is a goner. In short, no one was prepared for Season 3. And just before we wrap up the final moments of the premiere, let us pick up the book again, where just the duo of Tyrese and Rick go into the tombs. They run into a few walkers along the way, but the biggest surprise happens once they open up the cafeteria to see 4 inmates sitting around a table. Thing is, they appear to be very friendly, offering them food and saying that they have plenty of supplies. Moments later, the rest of the group join them for a warm meal, and things are honestly looking up. While Rick and the rest of the group is taken aback when they reveal that they aren't in fact guards but inmates, they still remain mostly friendly. Conversely, in the TV show, we are of course dealing with the Herschel situation, so the exchange is basically non-existent, and they do everything they can just to save Herschel, with the inmates being the second priority. They make it back to the cell block, and it's all hands on deck to save Herschel. And it's here that I have to mention something important. If you thought that the prison arc in the TV series was dark, you have no clue how tame it is comparing to the book. So moving forward, I will be dancing around certain things simply due to how YouTube works, but I will try to give you a good idea of what is going on. Put simply, the prison arc of the comic book, in my humble opinion, is one of the most twisted parts of the story. Not even Negan is as bad. But with that being said, let us pick up the book for a bit. After they've mostly settled in, Rick figures that he should return to the farm and tell Herschel, Glenn, and the others about the prison. He arrives to find out that the winter had been quite rough, and they agree to come back with Rick settling into the prison. We also get the exchange between Herschel and Rick, where Herschel explains how guilty he feels about almost shooting him before, though Rick quickly lets him know that he understands his situation and that there is no bad blood between them. Now, like I just said, here we have an event that I can't really talk about too much. But in short, Tyrese's daughter and her boyfriend both decide to end, at the same time. Rick wakes up to the gunshot ringing out in the night, and he and Tyrese immediately run to investigate what just happened, only to see Julie on the floor, but Chris still sitting there. Rage takes over and Tyrese gets revenge for his daughter. You can piece together what happens here. But the most notable thing is that during all of this, Julie turns despite not being bitten. We talked about this quite a bit already, but the fact that everyone turns no matter how they die was of course revealed by Rick at the end of Season 2, and known by him ever since the CDC. Well, here, that discovery is by complete accident. And so we have this scene of Rick waking up in the middle of the night with the realization that Shane would come back as well. So the next day, he gets on a motorbike and goes all the way back to Atlanta to dig up Shane. He puts him down for good and heads back for the prison. In the adaptation, things are also quite dicey, mostly stemming from some of the inmates, most notably Thomas, being against Rick and the group settling in the prison. This is also where we are once again reminded that Rick has very much become a different leader than we remember. with him openly telling Thomas that the prison is theirs, and if he has a problem with that, well, then he'll have more problems to deal with. Unlike the comic, where the inmates offered up food themselves, in the adaptation, Rick brokers a deal where they'd help them clear out a cell block, and in return, they get a share of the cafeteria's supplies. And so with that, we once again set off for the tombs. They end up getting ambushed, and Big Tiny, one of the inmates, is bitten. In response, Thomas brutally puts him down, following which we get the brief interaction between Daryl and Rick, where Daryl says to just give him a signal if something goes south. And just a short while later, things do very much go south, as Thomas opens the door, leading a massive amount of walkers straight to them. During this, Rick is almost hit by him, and it's here where we see Rick give Daryl the signal. He has made up his mind, and Thomas isn't going to make it out of here. And just like that, Rick machetes him in cold blood. I still remember watching this for the first time and getting serious chills. Just how matter-of-fact the whole exchange is masterfully conveys just how ruthless Rick has become. Furthermore, these couple of episodes really cement Daryl as Rick's go-to for basically anything. A simple glance between them is enough to convey what's about to happen, which will of course just become more and more pronounced later on. And again, keep in mind, Daryl does not exist in the book. This is entirely exclusive to the adaptation. In the books, on the other hand, there is no direct confrontation just yet. Instead, while Rick is still on his way back from the Atlanta camp, Herschel stumbles into a very gruesome scene of his two daughters. Now, I simply cannot show you this panel, it is very messed up, but you get the gist. Herschel is obviously devastated, and this is very much another event that pushes him further from his live-action counterparts. Instead of settling down and generally speaking becoming much more of the older, wiser, and more peaceful type of character, in the book he just becomes more hardened. Rick arrives back and is told what has happened, which prompts the group to restrain the inmate who had been a murderer before the apocalypse. While this is happening, we've got another absolutely messed up sequence. We cut to Andrea, who is doing laundry when Thomas, one of the inmates, approaches her. At first, he's seemingly here just to have a conversation, but then things go south as he pulls a knife on the lone Andrea and attacks her, revealing that he is the one responsible for Herschel's daughters as well. Despite getting a part of her ear cut off, Andrea fights him off and manages to run into the open courtyard where the rest of the group is. And here, Rick takes over. Again, I won't be able to show you all of the panels as, again, YouTube, but he absolutely beats him into the ground to the point where he wouldn't be able to use his hand again. Also, there's a very nice detail here in the colored deluxe version that's coming out right now. Notice how the background is getting more and more red, basically showing you Rick's mental state. You know how they say that I was so angry I saw red? That is very much the case here. And following this event, Rick establishes the admittedly short-lived rule of you kill, you die. Andrea and Rick are patched up by Dale, and Rick goes to apologize to Dexter for throwing him in the cell. Little do they know, him along with some of the remaining inmates had been planning a takeover. As for Thomas, he tries to attack the group again and is promptly shot by Maggie. Following which, we get a perfect example of just how different the comic Herschel is. They throw Thomas to the walkers, and Herschel is the only one to stay there and watch it until he is just gone. Needless to say, you probably can't imagine the live-action version even hearing of this, let alone watching it himself. As for the TV version, things at the prison are going reasonably well. The remaining inmates appear to be fine. Herschel wakes up and begins to move around, which again was a surprise even for the comic book folks, and the group is generally getting settled into their new home. Though, as you know, we are talking about one of the darkest episodes in the entire series. So this peaceful atmosphere is very short-lived. a large group of walkers suddenly flood the main courtyard, which we'd later find out were set free by Andrew, the inmate Rick chased down back in episode 2. The reaction to this episode in the community back then was, put briefly, complete and utter shock. This was, of course, a plot thread that was expected by the comic book readers, but the way it plays out is vastly different in pretty much every single way. The group is sent scrambling, but the most important ones in question is the duo of Carol and T-Dog, Maggie, Lori, and Carl, and of course Rick, Daryl, and Oscar, who are chasing down Andrew. And again, the deaths we see here were a surprise to basically everyone. T-Dog ends up sacrificing himself for Carol, and this obviously just came out of the blue. There was no plot thread or anything for this, it just happens. This is also the point where Carol goes missing. The couple of episodes before Daryl ends up finding her also made a lot of people think that she too didn't make it out of the events. And the other major group, Maggie, Lori, and Carl, are perhaps the most devastating. They get stuck in the tombs and Lori has to give birth with no assistance from neither Carol or Herschel. Again, this came completely out of left field, especially with it being such a brutal death, where Carl has to put down his own mother. That, on top of T-Dog's and apparent death of Carol, certainly made this an episode to remember, and once again cemented just how dark the series can be. Thing is, as I know many of you familiar with the source material are thinking, even this is nothing compared to the events of the book, though we will have to address those in the next installments. It's just that in this case, it was the timing that was incredibly surprising, especially with the whole Herschel being bit remix happening already in the premiere. But the last major group is of course Oscar, Rick, and Daryl, where we see Oscar picking his side by shooting Andrew and joining up with the survivors. Notice how Daryl is written into this encounter. Since Shane is now gone and Tyrese is yet to come into the TV version, Daryl is the perfect character to take the role of Rick's right hand, since they already have extensive history through both the events of Atlanta as well as the farm. Picking up the book again, after Thomas's death and being detained himself, Dexter pulls a gun on Rick and tells them to leave the prison. While this is going on, Otis is on his way to the prison, but is overrun by a group of walkers. All hope appears to be lost for him until a mysterious hooded lady wielding a katana appears. That, of course, being Michonne. She saves him and asks whether he would get her inside the prison, to which he agrees. There's a pretty major difference as to how she is introduced in both the story in general as well as to the survivors. Again, we'll talk about this a lot more later in the season and when the Governor arc properly picks up, but her initial interactions with the group are much more low-key in the books. Though before they arrive at the prison, the survivors are still being held up by Dexter. That is, until a large pack of walkers appear, forcing them to work together. Rick uses this opportunity to shoot Dexter without anyone noticing, and that is the end of that. And it's here where we get another panel that perfectly encapsulates yet another step in Rick becoming the cold-hearted leader that he would later become. As after they notice that Dexter had been shot, Rick simply responds, "Cry me a river." So yes, that is very much the end of the "you kill, you die" rule. Michonne and Otis arrive at the prison and she basically joins the group straight away. Rick considers her a very strong survivor and that's basically the end of that for now. Returning to the adaptation for a bit, the remaining smaller groups fight their way through the tombs and return to the main courtyard, where we get the absolutely legendary performance by Andrew Lincoln. I know this has been memed to hell and back over the past few years, but you cannot tell me that his acting here is not on another level. The realization on his face as he hears the baby cry behind him and only seeing Carl and Maggie is just so real. This seemingly pure moment of new life being born, twisted by his realization that Lori is no longer alive. Just the emotions, it's confusion, denial, and absolute grief as he realizes that Carl had to witness that. All followed by him just breaking down then and there. it is still one of the most powerful moments I have ever seen in all of television. Though speaking a little more broadly, I think this is also one of those moments that create two diverging paths in terms of Rick's character. In the book, so far, it's mostly just a series of terrible events where he has to play a leading role in some capacity. In the adaptation, on the other hand, now he himself is very directly affected. So while both versions become more and more detached from reality, in the TV version, that sudden jump does feel in some ways more believable. Though again, this is just for the time being. You'll see what I mean when we get to the Governor arc. In the comic, however, with the problematic inmates no longer being an issue, the survivors continue clearing out the prison. A group consisting of Axel, Rick, Dale, Tyrese, and Alan is formed, and they head into the tombs. This is where the events of the premiere take place, as Alan is bitten on his leg. Even if you haven't read the books yourself, you can probably tell why this was such a big shock when it was Herschel in the adaptation. Sure, Alan has been around since the beginning, but he's not exactly a front stage character. But just like in the adaptation, Rick immediately lands on the decision to remove his leg. Only this time, Herschel is around to help. Though as I mentioned before, Alan does not survive. And while that may seem like a fairly minor change, I'd argue that it actually has huge implications, since in the adaptation, this rash decision was in ways awarded. It cemented Rick as being the one capable of making these sorts of decisions. Well, in the source material, Tyrese would for a while actually blame Rick for doing that, despite knowing that the outcome would be exactly the same if Rick were to do absolutely nothing. He was bitten after all. And speaking of Tyrese, just in case you need a refresher, he is currently in a relationship with Carol, but when Michonne arrives, he cheats on Carol with her, an event that Carol sees with her own eyes. I can't show you this panel because YouTube, but Carol makes a very decisive decision, which thankfully Rick walks in on. They manage to stop the bleeding and she is saved. Considering the day he has just had, Rick goes to talk Tyrese about what happens, but sees him together with Michonne, putting the pieces together and figuring that this is what caused Carol to do what she did. Things get very heated as Rick blames Tyrese for her almost dying, and they get into a serious fight. And this is where what I mentioned before comes into play. Tyrese calls out Rick's recent actions. Firstly, shooting Dexter, and secondly, which stings the most, chopping off Alan's leg. He obviously says that he was trying to save him, but at the end of the day, there was no proof that it would work. Long story short, they beat each other up until Andrea walks in confirming that Alan did not make it. So now, at least subconsciously, there is the idea that Rick's leadership is already faulty, an aspect that is handled quite differently in the adaptation. Despite getting his head bonked by Tyrese and falling over the ledge, Rick still steps up and says that he will be the one to put down Alan. He does it and simply collapses. When Rick comes to, he is greeted by Dale, who tells him that he is no longer the sole leader. Instead, they have a committee for making decisions. He is mostly on board with this, even saying that he's glad that he won't have to be the one making all the decisions. And a similar committee does of course happen far later in the show as well, that being season 4. After their discussion, they both walk out to meet everyone. And this is where things once again get heated, as Tyrese openly says that Rick is just losing it. Even if you have not read the books, you will most likely have seen this panel as it is incredibly iconic. Rick goes on a speech about how every single thing he has done is to protect them, and even with this whole committee, he will continue to do what is best for the group, regardless of what they may think, ending by saying that when they die, they become them. Everything they have now is just borrowed time, and that they are the Walking Dead. This is an absolutely legendary moment in the books that was remixed far later into the series, season 5 to be exact, but most certainly depicts the state of the story and Rick's character. Things in the book have been quite dark so far, and are only about to get much worse. and this very much signals that. Obviously, everyone is a little taken aback by Rick's declaration, but there are still more pressing issues to handle, most notably making sure that such a swarm of walkers doesn't flood in again. They continue walking the tombs when Glenn and Maggie discover an armory full of ballistic/riot gear and weapons, things that are obviously very valuable in the apocalypse. On top of that, preparations are being made for an escape plan as well as running the large generator, for which fuel is needed. So this is the perfect time to test out the new gear by going to pump some gas just around the corner from the prison. This task is left to Rick and Glenn. Things are going mostly smoothly and it appears to be a fairly simple supply run. That is, until they spot a helicopter flying overhead. And for the sake of time, this is where we will leave it off for today. To sum up, in both versions the inmates have been dealt with. Many members of the group have been lost, even more so in the comic where Herschel has essentially lost his entire family apart from a few, but in the adaptation, Rick has lost Lori, sending him down the spiral of grief, rage, and everything else that comes with it. In the book, Michonne is already a part of the group, while in the adaptation, she has only made contact with Andrea, and the both of them are still out in the wild. And one last thing that I feel like I just need to restate, the story is about to get much darker, so in case you thought that the books were messed up already, well, you'll be surprised by the places we go next. But with that is pretty much the pre-Governor arc. And that's the video. I've been very happy to see a lot more people enjoying the retrospective series, which really made me put 110% into this one. And I can't wait to get into the real core of the season. But these chonkers are enough, my voice is gone. Though as usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Especially now with the channel struggling with all the copyright strike debacle. Seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month and get access to all the benefits. And last but not least, let us do the usual test to see how many of you have stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the word gingerbread. It's random, yes I know, but it's on my desk right now. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you did all the YouTube things to help with the blessing of the algorithm. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Look what we just uncovered. Excavator is ready to go. Keep it powered and protected from enemy fire. The scanner has picked up a target. Go to the dig site. We need another power cell for the excavator.
Without further ado, let us dive in. If you recall, we already talked about the information asymmetry that was in place between the two versions. That is to say, in the comics, the introduction of the Governor was basically out of the blue. There were no hints, teasers, or anything else of that nature. So, by default, people's expectations were very different from the live-action adaptation, where we had both the source material as well as plenty of pre-season information that clearly showed us the character. And as such, I think one aspect that the show massively missed out on, which we will get into, is the absolute shock of his introduction. But with that in mind, let us get into the events themselves. First and foremost, you will have noticed that in the first video covering Season 3, I jumped over the episode where the governor is actually introduced. And that was to purposely illustrate how different the approach was in the source material, because so far, just like the characters in the universe, we knew nothing about any other group out there. In the live-action version, however, right on the heels of the very first few episodes, we get a focus group following Andrea and Michonne, through which we are introduced to both the governor and Woodbury as a whole. Just like in the book, they spot a helicopter going down and decide to follow it. The big difference here is that in the TV version, that is the duo of Andrea and Michonne, who again have not made contact with Rick, while in the book it's Michonne, Rick, and Glenn. And just before we continue on this plot thread, there are a few events back at the prison which will be important later on. Firstly, after the death of Alan, Andrea and Dale adopt Billy and Ben. From now on, think of them as Mika and Lizzie from later in Season 4. And the other major thing is that Carol isn't really doing great after everything that she's been through, and because she feels very alone, but so close to Lori and Rick, asks if she can marry the both of them. I know if you haven't read the book, yeah, this probably seems a little random, but I promise it makes sense, so just keep that in mind. Lori is very taken aback and doesn't even know how to respond, but in essence says no and that is simply not possible. Returning to the adaptation, Andrea and Michonne make it to the crash site, where they run into the governor's group. And here, we'll have to return to the trailer to address something that I avoided talking about last time. The fact that Merle's return was already shown in the trailer. We'll talk about the importance of how the series will handle its trailers later in the run, but keeping in mind that Merle is a TV show exclusive character, I really don't get why his return had to be basically spoiled before the season even began. But alright, I guess that's not that big of a deal. Andrea and Michonne are captured and taken to Woodbury. In the books, the trio find a helicopter, but it is already completely empty, but has a ton of footprints around, leading Rick to believe that someone lives closer to this place than they do. And as such, they begin to follow the prints to meet these people. And it's here, and I will say this quite a few times again, the two versions diverge a lot, so do try to bear with me here. In the live-action version, Andrea and Michonne are treated extremely well and are invited to stay in the town. Thing is, Michonne picks up on some fishy business going on and believes that this whole nice governor persona is a facade. In the book, on the other hand, the trio continue to stumble through the night until they are suddenly overwhelmed by floodlights and machine gun fire. They are quickly pulled through the gates where we meet Martinez and the big man himself, the governor. Yes, if you haven't read the source material, it probably seems crazy, but indeed, Rick along with Glenn and Michonne are the first ever members of the survivors to meet the governor. They are led through the town where he shows them the fighting pits and talks about how they feed the walkers. After which, Rick asks them, what do they feed them? The governor simply responds, well, stranger, we feed them strangers. I think it's clear why the introduction of the governor was such a big deal. The leader of the group, the main character, being at the complete mercy of this villain was an absolutely terrifying concept that we sadly didn't really get in the adaptation. And by the way, they did try to pull some trickery in the trailer to make you think that Rick will talk to the governor a lot earlier in the season. Keep this in mind for later parts in the series. But instead, his portrayal in the live-action version is more so of a mastermind with a dark side. And in a way, as much as I like the brutal pirate version of the books, I think the live-actions version does make a lot more sense. You don't get a formidable group by feeding everyone you meet to walkers, right? So instead, the dark side of the governor is shown to us as he fakes a surrender to the army, who are then quickly shot down by his men hiding in the woods. And frankly, this instance is still one of my favorites in the franchise. It does an incredible job, especially if you weren't familiar with the source material, of bonking you over the head with the idea that quote-unquote good people didn't really exist anymore, and showing you that Woodbury is pretty much a facade. The live-action version of the governor is basically only interested in remaining as the leader, something that a large influx of actual soldiers may put in jeopardy, and as such, he took calculated action. And in case you weren't convinced that he is a bad guy just yet, the show also gives you the infamous head water tank collection, just to hammer home that he may appear as a charming dude, but he is still extremely ruthless. Maybe not as much as in the book, but still. From a narrative standpoint, introducing the bad guy in this sort of focus episode format is how many shows handle it. And since both the trailer as well as the source material had obviously revealed the governor already, I'm not sure how well the shocking approach of introducing his character would have worked. I think it's just a case of differences in mediums, as well as in this particular case, information asymmetry. So even if I would have loved to see Rick being the one to meet him, this sort of approach also worked fairly well considering what's about to happen. And final note here, if you remember what we talked about in Season 2 with Andrea and Shane, with her arrival at Woodbury in relationship with the governor, her character is basically nothing like her comic book counterparts, and as such, whenever I talk about Andrea in the book, just think of them as sharing a name and nothing else. Returning to the book, at this point, the group is held up at gunpoint with basically no escape. And it's here where we get one of the biggest and probably well-known differences take place. The governor just chops off Rick's hand. Yup, it's done just like that. The second issue he is ever a part of, he cements himself as a very bad dude. Rick obviously passes out, but Michonne tries attacking them, and even manages to bite off the governor's ear, though this proves to have been a very bad idea, since they are clearly far outmatched. Now, the old Kirk man is quite trigger happy with his characters, but not that much as to kill the main character here. We see Rick wake up and realize that he has indeed lost his hands. And we have to take a bit of a break from the story and have a meta discussion, as Kirkman's opinion on this event has changed somewhat throughout the years. In terms of practicalities, as much as I think everyone would have loved to see this moment adapted, it simply does not work for the show. The cost associated with always having to CG the hands of the main character of a show are just simply too high. On top of that, when reading a book, your suspension of disbelief is quite a bit more pronounced than when watching a show. So you see Rick do a bunch of things like climbing fences, etc, which would be far more difficult if it were to be done realistically. So it just limits the practical capabilities of the character. Kirkman's opinion on this has also changed in this sense. In 2011, Kirkman said that Rick's hand shouldn't be taken off in the adaptation, stating that these practical limitations are what he has run into when writing the book already. He comes up with something cool, but Rick simply cannot do it with a single hand, that in most cases is already occupied by a gun. More recently, however, Kirkman has said that he did always want Rick to lose his hand, so it seems like Kirkman too isn't too sure about which version turned out for the best. After Rick wakes up, we get an interesting parallel between the governor and Rick himself, as he is told that the governor naturally and quickly emerged as the leader, just like Rick himself. And considering the events of the pretty well-known differences take place, the governor just chops off Rick's hand. Yup, it's done just like that. The second issue he is ever a part of, he cements himself as a very bad dude. Rick obviously passes out, but Michonne tries attacking them, and even manages to bite off the governor's ear, though this proves to have been a very bad idea, since they are clearly far outmatched. Now, the old Kirk man is quite trigger happy with his characters, but not that much as to kill the main character here. We see Rick wake up and realize that he has indeed lost his hands. And we have to take a bit of a break from the story and have a meta discussion, as Kirkman's opinion on this event has changed somewhat throughout the years. In terms of practicalities, as much as I think everyone would have loved to see this moment adapted, it simply does not work for the show. The cost associated with always having to CG the hands of the main character of a show are just simply too high. On top of that, when reading a book, your suspension of disbelief is quite a bit more pronounced than when watching a show. So you see Rick do a bunch of things like climbing fences, etc, which would be far more difficult if it were to be done realistically. So it just limits the practical capabilities of the character. Kirkman's opinion on this has also changed in this sense. In 2011, Kirkman said that Rick's hand shouldn't be taken off in the adaptation, stating that these practical limitations are what he has run into when writing the book already. He comes up with something cool, but Rick simply cannot do it with a single hand that, in most cases, is already occupied by a gun. More recently, however, Kirkman has said that he did always want Rick to lose his hand, so it seems like Kirkman too isn't too sure about which version turned out for the best. After Rick wakes up, we get an interesting parallel between the governor and Rick himself, as he is told that the governor naturally and quickly emerged as the leader, just like Rick himself. And considering the events of the prison, where Rick had already gotten progressively more and more detached, it almost works like a what-if scenario where Rick would have somehow ended up as this cold-blooded, ruthless leader, such as the governor. As for the adaptation, things are quite a bit different. Rick is dealing with the death of Lori, which sends him down a spiral of emotions, leading the group to basically be without a leader for a while. In essence, almost everything that happens at the prison for this period of time is exclusive to the adaptation. And quick note, since I've seen some confusion about this, the people who Rick talks to on the phone are indeed ones we know. You can pick out Jim and Amy from back in season 1, as well as Lori. Also, there is a deleted scene where Rick finally catches up with Lori in the white dress, only for her to turn into a walker right in front of him. Just a random fun fact for you. Meanwhile in Woodbury, Michonne gets her stuff back and leaves the town. But since we are talking about the governor here, Merle along with a few other guys is sent after her. She takes out all of them aside from Merle. The duo trade blows and are both injured, though Merle continues to follow her until he runs into Glenn and Maggie, who are out on a supply run for baby formula and other supplies. Again, none of this happens in the book. They are both captured and taken to Woodbury, so at this point in both versions, Glenn is the only common factor of being held prisoner at Woodbury. Michonne, on the other hand, traces their steps back to the prison, where she is saved by the survivors and has her wounds treated. Their initial exchange is a little more heated than it was in the source material, but broadly speaking, she does feel much better about the prison than about Woodbury. We also find out that Daryl found Carol in the tombs, which had been a plot thread hanging on since Killer Within. Michonne then briefs everyone on Woodbury and how the two of them have been taken prisoner there. So with that, the squad assembles a force to liberate Glenn and Maggie. This is of course a major difference between the two. In the books, there is no assault on Woodbury at all, and no one would ever come to save any of them. Speaking of which, let us pick up the book, where Rick is still being treated for his hands, but Glenn and Michonne are being held prisoner. Now, here we have a part that I can't really show or even talk about, but just so you get an idea, the governor has a dungeon. A, kinda dungeon. And Michonne is taken there. Yes, it is that bad. In the adaptation, on the other hand, Glenn is interrogated by Merle and then has to fight off a walker, also very much demonstrating the difference between two versions. I've kinda talked about this in previous parts already, but the comic book version of Glenn never really seemed anywhere near as developed in terms of both personality as well as capabilities in the apocalypse. Conversely, in the adaptation, he never breaks, and it's Maggie that tells them about the prison. Returning to the book, as yet another form of punishment, Michonne is forced to fight in the pit, where she goes against what the governor told her and is once again put in the dungeon. Again, yes, it is that bad. Suddenly, however, Martinez runs into the doctor's office and tells Rick that he needs to come with him and that they are breaking out. He basically explains that he didn't think the governor would go as far as he did and he wants to save them. And quick notes, from the initial reading of the comic books, he does indeed seem like a good guy here. Taking a quick departure from Woodbury, it's here where Tyrese is finally introduced to the live-action version. I think it's clear to say from how much time has passed in the comics with him around already and his interactions with the group, that it will obviously be vastly different. Meanwhile, the survivors led by Rick begin their assault on Woodbury. And once again, we'll have to take a step back from the story for a moment and have a bit of a meta discussion of what this point signifies. This is what I view as the first real mid-season finale of The Walking Dead. That is to say, it's action-packed, with incredibly important story moments and a mandatory cliffhanger, which will have you coming back in February. Depending on who you ask, this is either the start of what ruined the show, or one of the most hype weeks of the year. Because I know opinion is very split on this, I'll just preface this entire thing by, please keep it civil. But I found myself flipping between these two camps. It's no secret that the rest of the series basically follows the 1-8-9-16 formula. Or in other words, important moments only happen in premieres, mid-season finales, mid-season premieres, and season finales. But on the other hand, I think the payoff moments that some of these episodes have could have never happened if it wasn't for this sort of approach. By definition, the payoff has to be cooked up, right? I still remember when this episode originally aired. Where I live, I could only watch the episodes on Mondays, so I had to spend the entire day off the internet to avoid spoilers. And bit of a personal fact, I guess, I used to swim competitively and we had practice on Mondays. And I just remember swimming laps while thinking, oh my god, what could have happened? I cannot wait to get home and watch it. And could that experience have been the same if it wasn't for the gigantic cooked up mid-season finales? Killer Within would say yes, but is that the exception to the rule, or? I'm not sure. And because I am so undecided on how I feel about the whole 1-8-9-16 thing, I'll pass the question on to you. How do you feel about the importance of these few episodes in the season? Good or bad, and most importantly, why? I'd love to hear your takes on this. Alright, back to the story. The survivors have a good old shootout with the forces of Woodbury and free both Glenn and Maggie. Michonne, on the other hand, is nowhere to be seen. That is because she goes to take out the governor for sending Merle and the other dudes after her. In the books, however, with the help of Martinez, they free Glenn and Michonne and are ready to escape. But Dr. Stevens and Alice decide to tag along with them. Similar to the adaptation, Michonne stays behind and goes after the governor. Though remember that in the book, he didn't try to kill her like he did in the adaptation. He did something that is arguably much worse. And as such, what happens in his apartment simply cannot be on YouTube. But to give you an idea in case you have not read it, she uses a spoon multiple times in multiple places, the same spoon. She uses a drill multiple times in multiple places, and just like he did to Rick, she chops off his hands and a bunch of other things that are just a big ol' yikes. But the thing is, she leaves him alive. In the adaptation, there's an actual fight that breaks out between them, and he does of course lose the eye. Compared to the books though, that is a very small sacrifice. Still talking about the adaptation, after the successful rescue mission, the group escapes pretty much straight away, only to realize that Daryl has been captured and is forced to fight his brother, who everyone thought was dead. Another assault ensues, and Daryl along with Merle are saved, and everyone including Michonne are on their way back to the prison. In the book, while escaping, Dr. Stevens is bitten, and the rest of the group are forced to run off anticipating that they get caught otherwise. A short while later, Michonne manages to catch up with them, and the group, now with Martinez and Alice joining them, head back for the prison. And following this point, the stories diverge massively again. So we will be jumping between the two and just talking about the major events. Though in the book, before we return to the primary plots, we get a check-in with Morgan and his son celebrating Christmas. Very timely for this video, I know. Nothing of real note happens, and for now, it's just a nice look into what they're up to. For the survivors though, they return to the prison to see it overrun by walkers, clearly making them think that they've been attacked. Though we would quickly learn that it had just been a mess up by the survivors themselves. They start clearing out the courtyard again, and for the most part, things calm down for a bit. That is, until Rick notices Martinez being gone. Straight away, he realizes that his apparent help was nothing more than an intel gathering mission, and he chases him down with the RV and puts him down, stopping him before he could get back to the governor. So yes, the entire mission to set free Rick and the others was all taught up by the governor. In the adaptation, on the other hand, the governor retaliates straight away with an attack on the prison straight after they had left Woodbury. Put very briefly, both this, as well as everything else to follow, is a TV show exclusive. The whole Daryl and Merle leaving debacle is by default a live action thing. The return to more